like to welcome everyone today to our panel, Political Polarization and Trump Populism. Is National Unity Possible? Today's panel is co-sponsored by the American Politics Speaker Series, which is run out of the Political Science Department here at Columbia University. It's also co-sponsored by the Academy of Political Science and by the Urban and Social Policy Program at the School of International and Public Affairs, also here at Columbia. I want to note that today's event is being recorded, so for what that's worth, just keep that in mind. And this way, people who can't attend are still going to be able to hear the interesting conversation that happens here today. My name is Justin Phillips. For those who don't know, I'm a professor in the American politics here at Columbia University, and also the faculty coordinator of the American Politics Speaker Series. Before we get started, I'd like to thank my colleague, Professor Robert Shapiro and Lauren Kondo of the Academy of Political Science for their hard work in organizing this. So I'm going to start by introducing the members of our very prestigious panel here today. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking, and then once I've introduced them all, we'll move to their opening statements. Our first speaker is Shanto Ayangar, who's a professor of political science at Stanford University, and also the director of the university's political communication lab. His area of expertise include the role of mass media in democratic societies, public opinion, and political psychology. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of course, the author of several groundbreaking books, including News That Matters, Television and American Opinion, and Going Negative, How Political Advertisements Shrink and Polarize the Electorate. Our second speaker will be Diana MUTZ. She's the Samuel A. Stouffer Professor of Political Science and Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the director for the Institute for the Study of Citizens and Politics at the Annenberg School for Communication. Professor MUTZ studies public opinion, political psychology, and mass political behavior, with an emphasis on political communication. Also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the author of numerous relevant books, including In Your Face Politics, The Consequences of Uncivil Media, as well as The Obama Effect, How the 2008 Campaign Changed White Racial Attitudes. Our third speaker will be Megan Ming Francis, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington, and currently a visiting associate professor of public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Her research interest focuses on American political and constitutional development, race, crime, philanthropy, and civil rights. And she's the author of the prize-winning book, Civil Rights, The Making of the Modern American State. So how we will proceed is we will go in the order that I introduced the speakers. Each will speak for about 15 minutes. And then we'll open up to a period of question and answers. And the way that the Q&A will work is that you can either type your question in the Q&A box, and that might be the easiest approach, or you can raise your hand through the raise hand function. Of course, that will be relevant later in today's proceedings, but let's go ahead and begin with Professor Ayangar.
Okay, well, thanks, Justin. Thanks for inviting me. So the question we were asked to address is national unity possible? And my answer is pretty straightforward. It is no. And my answer is based on research documenting that there is this huge divide across the Democratic and Republican parties today, and it's not the conventional divide, which of course is ideological. So if you look at polarization research in our discipline, most of the work in the 1980s and 1990s was focusing on the extent to which Democrats and Republicans were moving to the extreme on the ideological spectrum. Democrats becoming the liberal party, and Republicans becoming the conservative party. The work that I'm referencing, and I'm going to show maybe 4 slides is all, is looking at polarization from a somewhat different angle. It's a question of to what extent do partisans distrust and dislike their political opponents. So the term that's used in the literature is affective polarization. So essentially, what I'm going to be arguing is that the degree of inter-party animus today is so high that it's unlikely that we will see some sort of a sense of bipartisanship or compromise in legislative bodies. As of course, the COVID relief bill passed the other day, and exactly as we might anticipate, with zero votes from Republicans. Okay, so if I could, is it okay for me to share the screen? I'll just do so very briefly. As I said, I've only got, I think, 4 slides. This graph, I think, has showed up in lots of papers. This is the American National Election Studies, which has, of course, this infamous item known as the Feeling Thermometer, which goes from 0 to 100, where people can say, I feel extremely cold, i.e., I dislike this target, this person, this group, this object you're asking me to evaluate. Or you can say, I'm very warm, 100. This thermometer was introduced by Warren Miller way back in the early 1970s. And so we've got this nice time series. And you can see the top 2 lines are simply where Democrats and Republicans, they tend to like their own party. I mean, the thermometer rating is, fairly warm. And it shows no movement whatsoever over the last 30 years. You see, the movement has occurred in terms of how people feel toward their opponents. So if you look at the out-party rating, which is Democrats' thermometer rating of Republicans and vice versa, you can see that around 1988, 1992, the slope begins to shift fairly significantly downward. And now you've got this net difference that is quite substantial. This slide doesn't particularly get at what's been going on over the last few cycles. So if you look at this, the thermometer scores that are actually 0, where, I mean, you can't get any lower than that. You can see that that's the blue line on this slide. You can see that in recent cycles, quite a few Americans are rating the opposition party as the maximal point of negativity. Keep in mind that this is a face-to-face, in general, most of the data in this slide, online surveys increasingly outnumber the face-to-face in the post-2000 era. But keep in mind that this is generally a face-to-face survey. So when you say this, it's in the presence of an interviewer. And given what we know about social norms and civility and politeness and so on and so forth, you would think that there would be some incentives for respondents to avoid saying 0. And in fact, if you look at the thermometer ratings of other groups, African Americans, Latinos, Muslims, Hindus, atheists, I mean, I can go through the laundry list of all the groups. There is no group that comes close to eliciting the level of extreme negativity as the opposition party. Now, of course, you could argue that these other social groups are protected by social norms. One does not choose their ethnicity or their religion. And so you could say there's a degree of protection, whereas political party is a voluntary association. And so you could say that people are more blameworthy. You can hold them accountable, and therefore people feel more justified in condemning political opponents. I think it's a sort of a mixed bag, the survey evidence, because if you, one thing we do know is when you look at the online ANES data and compare it to the face-to-face, there's a very significant gap. There's a mode effect. Online respondents are significantly more hostile. It's an anonymous survey. They're not being confronted by an interviewer. Anyway, okay, so this is survey data, and we all know that we need to take survey data with a grain of salt. It's all self-reported. You could argue it's cheap talk. Maybe people are just saying this. They don't really mean it. I just want to give you this more recent data where it's not just adults who are polarized. It's now in the bloodstream of the body politic, so to speak. So we've got data now on middle school and high school kids who were asked questions about trust in their favorite party and in the Democratic and Republican parties. Steve Chafee, the late Steve Chafee, did the survey in Wisconsin in 1980, and the left panel shows among children and adolescents, you can see that in 1980, the in-party, out-party gap in trust is negligible. It's there, but I mean, it's very slight. Kids tend to sort of rate their own party. They're more trusting of their own party, but only slightly. But in 2019, when we replicate this with the identical question, you can see that it's now, there's a chasm, and it's plateaued by age 11. So it's not like in the old days, the socialization literature would say, well, early childhood is characterized by blanket positivity, and these partisan components only begin to intrude around adolescence and early adulthood. Well, this doesn't seem to be the case today. Okay, I said that survey data might be subject to various artifactual properties. We've also run a variety of alternative tests of partisan animus. This is from a paper that Sean Westwood and I wrote some years ago, in which we developed an implicit or subconscious measure of partisan prejudice. The race literature, of course, it's well documented that the verbal reports are suspect for a variety of reasons. So the psychologists have developed a couple of well-known implicit measures. This is the implicit association test. It's essentially a reaction time measure developed by Tony Greenwald and Mazu Banerjee. It's widely used in psychology. It has a metric. It goes from -2 to +2. And as you can see, the gold standard is racial bias. Implicit racial bias is at the bottom panel here. You can see that there is significant racial bias, but it's dwarfed in terms of implicit partisan bias. Implicit partisan bias exceeds implicit racial bias. So this suggests that the survey data are not just cheap talk. It's genuine. This is meaningful animus that we're registering in these various national surveys. Okay, the last point I want to make is that polarization, it's now reached the point where the party queue is intruding into a variety of other domains. There's a lot of work on friendships, for example. Friendship groups are now homogeneous. Facebook, the online network that most of us participate in, it's about 75% homogeneous, same party, same ideology. And most troubling to me is that the partisan queue is now invading factual beliefs. And so we've seen a wave of misinformation. And of course, you know, the big lie, the fact, you know, that Trump's claims about what happened in the 2020 election, significant numbers of Republicans still believe that Trump, in fact, defeated Joe Biden. So we've been looking into misinformation. And so you can see, here's a bunch of questions that we've asked people about. These are well-known statements. The top 5 here are all statements made by President Trump. Immigrants committing crime at higher rates than natives, significant voter fraud in the 2016 election, Obama ordering a wiretap on Trump Tower. And so as you can see, the partisan divide on those questions is huge, suggesting that, as John Zoller indicated many, many years ago, when political elites make claims, their followers tend to adopt these claims, no matter what the veracity of the claim might be. Now, once again, there is this debate in political science, although in the aftermath of January 16th, I rather doubt that this debate is still alive, that some people argue that misinformation is simply cheap talk. It's what is called cheerleading, that people actually know the correct answer, but it's costless for them to say, well, I'm going to go along with what President Trump says. Well, I mean, unless you happen to believe that the people who stormed the Capitol were just sort of doing this to cheerlead for Trump and not genuinely believing that the election had been stolen. When you pay people to get the answer correct, which is a standard accuracy, sort of accuracy-oriented treatment, previous studies have shown that misinformation falls quite dramatically, but these previous studies by Marcus Pryor and John Bullock and others have used misinformation questions that are minimally valenced, that have very little partisan valence. Questions about the size of the budget deficit, for example. That doesn't exactly make a Democrat or Republican feel super motivated to toe the party line. But here, these are highly valenced, and I'm not going to show you these results, but when we pay people up to $1 to get $1 per question for correct answers. And we show in this paper, the Peterson and Ayangar paper, that it only modestly reduces the partisan divide by about 25%. So you've still got a massive divide even after people are incentivized to provide accurate answers. Okay, so I've probably gone over my time, so I will, yes, I have by about 1 minute. So I will stop and simply say that in my view, the gulf across the chasm across the party divide is so wide today that I don't anticipate any sort of bipartisanship or quote unquote unity in the near term, certainly not in the first couple of years of the Biden administration for sure. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those interesting comments. All right, I'll turn it over to Professor Montz, our second speaker.
Hey, thanks very much for including me today. I'm actually going to play the role of anti-Shanto today. I'm going to try to
what else is new? What else is new?
No, I'm going to try to bring some silver linings into the discussion today. I've decided on a Monty Python themed presentation. We've all heard extensively from Shanto and others about how horribly bad affective polarization has become. And it has reached even higher levels in 2020 based on the preliminary data that we've seen. So I'm going to try to brighten everyone's day a little by talking about the bright side of affective polarization. And I can't whistle worth a darn, so I won't even try. But if you want to do the little Monty Python ditty to yourself while I'm talking about this, you're very welcome to. I thank my graduate students, Tyler Lee, Nick Diaz, and Chloe An, for helping me throw together today's presentation. These are really preliminary findings from a couple of studies that we have in progress. I'll be completely honest and confess that I've never actually studied affective polarization as a dependent variable in any of my work before. But in thinking about the request to talk today, it struck me that a couple of the studies that I'm working on right now in preparation for the MPSA and other conferences, they have affective polarization as a really important conditional facilitative variable in these analyses. So these are both studies in very early stages at this point, so I'm unlikely to be able to answer all of your questions, but they both highlight downstream consequences of affective polarization. And I'm going to talk about two different types of downstream consequences. One has to do with strategic voting in presidential primaries. And the second is a study looking at turnout in general elections. So let me start out by talking about strategic voting. And again, this is with two co-authors, Nick Diaz and Tyler Lee. We basically had the hypothesis that electability would be far more important than viability to Democrats in 2020. In part due to the extremely high levels of affective polarization. And so we wanted to test the hypothesis that affective polarization actually facilitates a greater emphasis on electability in the strategic sense. And the logic for this is pretty straightforward, as suggested by the quote. When you believe the opposing party to be an enemy, the costs of letting them win simply become too high. So that was our basic idea. Now, obviously, we can't do this same study in an era of less affective polarization, but we can look for variation across people in levels of affective polarization. So what we are looking at is panel data that the first wave is pre-primary in 2019. We had a total sample size of about 3,400. About half of those were Democrats. And what we did is we randomly assigned half of that sample to be re-interviewed post Iowa and New Hampshire, and the other half to be interviewed post Super Tuesday. And what we wanted to look at was obviously change over time in things like the perceived viability of candidates, that is, changes in the chances people saw of that candidate winning the nomination, as well as changes in perceived electability, that is, their chances of winning a general election. And we collected all the other usual suspects as well at both points in time. We used a measure of affective polarization that was pre-primary, meaning the question is, how did the level of affective polarization a person brought to the presidential primaries affect how they evaluated candidates during the course of the primaries themselves? So let me start out by just showing you some descriptive information about what happened during that period of time. Again, we're talking about pre-primary, post-Iowa and New Hampshire, and then post-Super Tuesday on the far right. If you look particularly at Biden's likability, this is feeling thermometers toward the candidates. Biden started out in very good shape as the most likable of the primary candidates in the pre-primary period. Obviously, he takes a hit post-Iowa and New Hampshire, and Bernie Sanders is elevated in likability. By post-Super Tuesday, Biden is once again back on top in terms of being the most liked candidate. Obviously, if electability has its effects purely by means of raising the likability of candidates, we're not really talking about pure strategic voting. Strategic voting we typically define as when they don't change who they like, they simply say, you know what, even though this isn't my most liked candidate, I'm going to go ahead and support him because he has better chances of winning. Candidate viability follows a pretty similar aggregate kind of trajectory here, where Biden is seen as most viable in the pre-primary period, drops down in the post-Iowa, New Hampshire period, and then pops back up again post-Super Tuesday. What's interesting that we found is previous studies have pretty much only looked at either viability effects or electability effects, but not both in the same study. And the reason for that is that they tend to follow very similar trajectories. And in fact, a lot of people project onto the candidate they like the most that they are also most electable or most viable. So it's a very difficult thing to try to sort out the effects of viability and electability as they change over time during the course of the primary process. Here we're looking at electability. As you can see, it looks like pretty similar pattern. However, using a panel-based analysis of individuals as they are changing over time, we're able to disentangle the effects of viability and electability, even though there is in these data, as in most data, a significant overlap in who people find most viable and most electable. What I'm showing you here is a fixed effects panel analysis from pre-primary to post-Iowa, New Hampshire, looking at the same people, and looking at the coefficients here suggest the effects of a change in electability on a change in support for Biden. So what you see in that first row is that electability does indeed have a really important impact on support for Biden over time. Now, keep in mind, this is pre-primary to post-Iowa, New Hampshire, and what a positive coefficient means here is simply that a change in electability goes hand in hand with a change in support for Biden. It doesn't mean it's in a positive direction, and of course, as we saw, actually Biden's electability and viability drop a great deal during this period of time. So the change that we're seeing, because the average change is toward less electability, is actually Biden being lowered in terms of the number of people who express preferences for Biden. Nonetheless, the important part is that electability is a really important consideration. Notice that it persists in being a really important consideration even after we take into account likability. That is, even if they're not changing how much they like Joe Biden, they're changing their level of support for him, their likelihood of voting for him. What we don't see here is any effect from prior levels of affective polarization on the likelihood that a change in electability actually influences their likelihood of selecting Biden. However, if we look at the pre-primary to post-Super Tuesday period, we see that these strong effects from electability are, in fact, as you see down at the bottom of the screen, due to people with high levels of affective polarization. For people who really hate Republicans, they are willing to place electability above all else. And in fact, they're the ones who are really carrying the importance of electability by the time Super Tuesday happens. So what we see here is strong evidence of strategic voting based on electability. We include the interaction between viability and prior affective polarization, not because there's any logical reason why viability should influence support, based on levels of affective polarization, but more or less because we want to show that we can distinguish between people who are affectively polarized, who take electability into account as a result, but they don't seize upon viability to any greater degree than anyone else does. Okay, what are the implications of this, and why do I say this is a bit of a silver lining, a counter to Shanto's gloom and doom? Well, I say that because electability-based primary preferences are encouraging the selection of more moderate candidates, even though ideological distance from the candidates was totally irrelevant to people's changing vote choices over time in our panel analysis. What's happened is that people selected a more moderate candidate because they were weighing electability so highly, because they hated the other side so strongly. So more politically moderate elected officials have the potential to diffuse out-party animosity to some extent. That is, selecting Biden as opposed to Sanders is probably likely to contribute in the long term to less affective polarization than would having selected a more ideologically extreme Democrat as the nominee. Obviously, the results of these studies also suggest that dynamics of specific states over time, their racial profile of those states, and the timing of those states in the dynamic presidential primary process also matters a great deal. One of the ironic things about this, though, is that the presidential primary process really highlights viability more than electability, right? Because what we're hearing about is who other Democrats support, not about who the public at large is supporting. So in a lot of ways, it's even more surprising that electability weighs so heavily in Democrats' selection of Joe Biden, given that the results of these primaries are more directly relevant to viability than they are to electability. So one of the questions I think this raises is obviously what happens among Republicans in 2024. Do they similarly care about electability to such a great degree that it drives their choice of presidential nominee as well? And obviously, I'm not going to predict the future here. We know that Republicans are a less educated segment of the population right now, and that strategic voting is more likely among better educated segments of the population in general. So there's certainly no guarantee there, but it does suggest that there is, in some sense, the seeds of polarization's demise when people weigh electability heavily and care a lot about how well this candidate will run among those on the other side. Second study I'm going to talk about briefly is with another grad student, Chloe Ahn, and what she and I have been looking at is what are the implications of rising affective polarization for political participation. And what I'll show you real quickly here, so as not to take up too much time, is some results from ANES data that are on self-reported as well intent to vote, as well as post-election self-reported actual voting, as well as validated voting. And then finally, we'll look at some panel data from 2016 to 2020. To look at what the increase in affective polarization between 2016 and 2020 might have meant for turnout. So this is the relationship between affective polarization and voting intention. We got a whole lot of variables in there. I'm just showing you some of the usual suspects here that predict turnout cross-sectionally. What you see has a real consistent effect of affective polarization, and this is binned to a 20-point scale rather than the full 100 points. But looking at how affective polarization predicts vote likelihood of saying you intend to vote. And it very consistently does across years as well as in the aggregate. Again, not that surprising. People who really hate the other side are really going to want to turn out to vote. Same thing for post-election reports of voter turnout. People who are affectively polarized are much more likely to vote, or at least to report self-reported post-election turnout. Validated turnout, however, is something different. And again, here I show for the years that we have ANES data that have voter validation measures, to what extent it predicts. And what you see is much weaker results. And that does suggest that to some extent, affective polarization is expressive. Now, I like Shanto, I don't think it needs to be either or. I think there, a 25% reduction in affective polarization is something we'd all welcome. So to the extent that some portion of it is expressive, that is what we may be witnessing here, is that when it comes to actual turnout, we don't see the same extent of effective affective polarization. There's still a relationship when we have a really large sample, but it's a much weaker one. Finally, we also looked at campaign participation, the index that's in the American National Election Studies. And again, we find very consistent evidence that the more affectively polarized you are, the more activities you report participating in during the campaign. Obviously, we don't have a validated measure of that particular index. Obviously, what all of this suggests is that maybe we should reconsider what we normally think about as one of the key indicators of a healthy democracy. And everywhere you look, people like to seize upon high turnout figures as an indicator of how healthy democracy is. Now, I'll be honest with you, those of you who've read previous work that I've written, I'm not crazy about that as an indicator of the health of democracy at all. But of course, given that turnout was very, very high in 2020, and many people are very happy about that, we have to ask ourselves, are we really comfortable looking at just mass turnout levels as an indicator of the health of democracy? Or do we need something a lot more refined than that? When people are angry and affectively polarized, I'm certain that's good for turnout, but I'm not at all certain that's a sign of a healthy democracy and something that we should use as an indicator. People can turn out for lots of different reasons, and being extremely angry about how democracy is faring can be one of those. And this is just an old quote from Robert Dahl suggesting that high levels of participation don't necessarily mean what we might think they do, and that we ought to consider other kinds of indicators of the health of democracy. I myself, if I had to choose between, a highly affectively polarized population that turns out in droves as opposed to a highly tolerant population where far fewer people turn out, but it's a representative few, I would far rather have that than a highly politicized environment of the kind we've had in the last 4 years in particular. So just to summarize, affective voting, we suggest, based on these very preliminary findings, facilitates strategic voting based on electability. And that obviously means that Democrats, at least in this case, are taking into account who Republicans are willing to support for office. That, I suggest, has a moderating effect. Affective polarization may also encourage turnout, which some people are very excited about, but these effects may be quite small when we start looking at validated turnout measures. We have panel data that show us that, in fact, in terms of intent to vote, yes, those who increased in affective polarization also increased intent to vote. But we may not find that that's true once we have validated voting data. It's too early at this point. The validated voting data haven't been distributed yet. So we don't know for 2020 whether that was actually the case. Affective polarization also appears to encourage greater campaign-related participation. I totally get that. I was part of that campaign-related participation that was higher in the past election than in previous years. So I'm going to leave it here that not all of affective polarization's downstream effects are necessarily negative ones. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Diana. All right, let me turn the floor over to Professor Ming Francis.
Excellent. All right, so it's wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be in conversation with my two esteemed panelists and an excellent moderator. And I'm really thankful for everybody who's taking time out of their day to spend it online with us in Zoom land today. So, all right, I'm going to share my screen. I have about 2 slides. So let's go. All right. Oops, actually, I'm going to stop the share here. I always have technical difficulties. Okay. And there we go. Share screen. All right. Can you see that okay? Just give me a thumbs up, Justin. Okay, great. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today is not necessarily, let's be clear here. If anybody knows my background, I am not somebody who writes and publishes around political polarization in American politics. I am more clearly situated in the camp that focuses on American political development and REP. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is not necessarily, or kind of the second part that comes after the colon, which is national unity possible? To that question, I mean, maybe I align somewhere in the middle about that question about is national unity possible in a Biden administration? I don't see it happening in a Biden administration. I probably don't see it happening in my lifetime, if I'm honest. What I can say, though, and what I do believe is that unity, in terms of that we can move much closer to that. That, in my opinion, and at least in terms of my area of research, one of the areas, and I want to be very clear about where I'm situated in, one of the areas that I think that we can do a lot more about to get us closer to an idea of national unity is to focus much more on the issue of race and violence in American politics. It seems to be that both, and I'm going to say them separately, but obviously we can think about them together. And when I talk about race, I'm often talking about racism and white supremacy. That it seems that it has been a long trend over the course of history in American politics to either minimize or to ignore the continuing power of white supremacy in American politics. It has also been the case that we tend to think of violence as erupting in kind of these silos and these different moments, but as something of the past. And so one of the interesting things that happened over the course of 2020, and definitely on January 6th, as we saw in so many ways, the anger, which was in part fueled by polarization, right, in terms of individuals, this big rift between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, but also being fueled by a strong sense of white nationalism, which was weaponized. And so what I'm going to talk about in my comments, my remaining 12 minutes that I have today, are thoughts about how we might address the issues around racial violence and white supremacy and move more towards racial justice in this country, and what a possible Biden administration might do, and our actions that can be taken and that are needed to help this country move towards that. And so in this slide, I just wanted, in terms of kind of very quickly say that one of the issues that I think that we should focus much more about is this history, the longer history of white supremacy and the long pattern of racial violence. And this can be kind of my APD training here and thinking about racial violence, again, not just as something that erupts in these silos, but as a pattern that happens, right? In terms of some people think about the period of enslavement as the original sin, or genocide as the original sin. But one of the issues that I often talk to, especially with my students, I'm currently teaching American politics, the big 250 student intro course at the University of Washington right now. And we started early. And so class was already in session before January 6th happened. And they wanted to try to understand what in the world, like, why could this happen? And not the entire understanding, but part of the understanding around January 6th stems from the inability to deal with the past, right? That there's these moments in periods of violence, whether that's around the period of enslavement, and then we move to the period of Reconstruction. But even through Reconstruction, there's extreme violence, and then the aftermath of Reconstruction and Jim Crow in the South and Jim Crow in the North. And then we move to another kind of violence system through the criminal punishment system, and then that which expanded up until now. So there really, in terms of, haven't been these moments, right, for kind of a collective taking a beat and understanding what happened in the past and what ways were local, state, and the federal government complicit in violence towards Indigenous communities and violence towards Black communities in this country. And it seems to me that polarization, of course, and this is the kind of the purview of of colleagues of mine, is tapping into kind of like a number of different issues. And one of them, I think, for me, that's been really interesting is that there's been, I feel like, a lot of focus on white grievance politics and tribalism. especially in Congress. But one of the things for me that I've always thought a lot about is what is actually fueling white grievance politics and what is actually fueling tribalism. There's a new study that actually has been fielded by my colleague, Chris Parker at the University of Washington, which has revealed, I think, some really interesting findings, especially around MAGA individuals who identify themselves as MAGA supporters. And it shows quite clearly that race and racism is a strong driver of their support for Trump. All right. So that's kind of like in terms of where I am situated and what I think matters. When we talk about polarization, I think we should always be also talking about what is fueling that, and also always thinking about the role of race in polarization. In terms of the proposals and ideas about like what could actually be done to move us more towards national unity. And I want to say that there's obviously a lot of things that can be done around the environment, that can be done around healthcare, that can be focused on in terms of different areas. But again, my focus is really going to be specifically around what might be done around racial justice. And so what I'm going to pull from for my comments are some recommendations that I did as part of a social and economic justice leaders program, which was focused on thinking about power building through feedback loops. And this is something that I sat down over 2 months this summer. It was a project that was spearheaded by Connie Raza, Deepak Bhargava, and Alex Hertel Fernandez. And I was tasked with, okay, if we get to November and we get past November, and there is a possible Biden administration, what might be needed to be done about racial justice? And so one of the issues, of course, is going to be, as I mentioned in the previous slide, this larger issue about kind of accountability and reckoning with past harm, I think needs to be a significant part of what is necessary to move forward. But I want to say in terms of my thinking, and after I kind of spent the over a month in thought, I came out with 4 main recommendations, and I want to basically spend the rest of my time talking about why I think that they are so important. And again, I want to be clear that these are not the only ones that are important, though. The first is that a kind of a reckoning with America's past to build narrative power. And it strikes me that addressing the persisting patterns of racial violence and white nationalism requires a clear understanding of history and its connection to present day injustices. Through executive action, I think that it would be perhaps quite valuable for Biden to establish a White House Public Education and Monuments Advisory Council comprised of scholars, community members, and experts. The advisory council would be responsible for developing a criteria for monument removal, identifying monuments that celebrate racial violence, and creating monuments in some cases to honor a more diverse range of history makers. Accompanying the process of monument removal, the advisory council would perhaps have the authority to design a process that would engage the broader public in a dialogue about monuments of controversial figures and an informational process around each monument removal. The advisory council should designate and work with and fund monument advisory task forces comprised of community leaders, local artists, and activists in every state where a monument is slated to be removed. And here I am trying to think through part of it seems that, especially around the election and then the election's aftermath, that one of the things, especially as a teacher, that always strikes me as fascinating around the history of race in this country is how much people don't know. It seems that some of the people that are most educated about the history of race in this country tend to be the people that want to do that type of work. And to me, it would be really interesting and I think really valuable to engage in much more of a public dialogue and education process behind that. Number 2, restructuring the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives to entrench the power of racial justice organization. So this is something, I mean, there's not enough time to say all that I want about this, but this is me trying to think through that the very survival of racial justice organizations depends on the acquisition of resources. And I'm trying to think about how, I was trying to think through and still am trying to think through how the federal government can provide resources to and elevate the work of racial justice organizations instead of having it completely separate from the way that government operates. And the government, right, the federal government has done this before under the administration of Lyndon Johnson. In '64, Johnson signed into law the ambitious and well-funded Equal Opportunity Act, the first piece of war on poverty legislation. Soon after, the principle of what we know as maximum feasible participation was enshrined into the Equal Opportunity Act, which meant that winning the war on poverty would require the participation and independence of organizations in poor communities. According to the wonderful historian Elizabeth Hinton, she writes, quote, "For activist organizers and residents of segregated communities throughout the United States, maximum feasible participation opened the door for radical approaches to disrupting existing racial hierarchies and exercising the claims to self-determination increasingly voiced by mainstream civil rights leaders," end quote. And so here I am trying to think that kind of grassroots organizations and poor communities received, right, direct federal funding to spend how they determined was best to address the social problems in their communities. However, we know that it barely lasted a year as local and state officials joined forces to oppose community action organizations and defunded emerging anti-poverty programs, viewing them as adversaries instead of potential coalition partners. And so I think it would be interesting here thinking about the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives created by executive order through George W. Bush, I think provides a useful model of what might be, what the possibility of something to combine funding and incorporation and dialogue with community organizations. The mission of the Faith-Based and Community Initiatives Office was to lead a determined attack on poverty, diseases, and other social problems in partnership with faith-based and community organizations. And thinking about how to build power for racial justice organizations, the Biden administration could learn from the boldness of, I think, this initiative and create a similar office, which has already kind of restarted the Obama faith-based office. But I think that in terms of it should, of course, operate differently. While Bush's office was focused on working with faith-based and community organizations on social services and helping organizations to apply to federal and private funding, the Biden administration's efforts should be broader than Bush's and expand the scope of the office to include more emphasis on community organizations and a greater coordination with policymakers. I think it also should be different than the Obama administration's office in terms of the power and the reporting structure of the office. I know that I'm kind of running out of time. Hold on. Let's go. Just kind of two quick things on the two final ones because I'm running on at time. On the federal government to diminish the power of the criminal punishment system, and this is thinking about the different ways that the federal government could be part of, not necessarily, I think, in terms of the present administration getting rid of federal incarceration, but thinking about how to shrink the system and how to bring in people that have been directly affected by the system into a commission and or a task force to look over policies and think about the current operation of the system. And then lastly here seems to be very important to me, a kind of a COVID-19 racial equity commission. And it's clear that in terms of the way that relief has been structured, it has not taken into account the role of race in structuring relief. What we know for sure is that a race neutral safety net will not be sufficient to address the significant disadvantage borne by communities of color. And similar to the race-based recovery of the Great Recession, will lead to deeper economic inequality. And I think that these is kind of like a beginning, not like the full suite of things that are necessary to repair racial justice or like repair racism in this country and to get us closer to racial justice. But it's clear that many people, especially individuals on the right, think that we are currently engaged in a race war. And it seems necessary to disabuse individuals of that and to work on our understanding of the past and also on the present. It seems to me also, and this is the last thing I'll say, that there are tremendous opportunities in the present moment about individuals organizing, whether that's through the movement for Black Lives or through other means, to think about how we might move, how might we address past racial harm and move to a different place. The for real, last thing I'll say on this is I've been thinking a lot about, Steve Tellis has a really interesting, he's a political scientist at Hopkins, has an interesting paper that I've been thinking about. He wrote it in 2009. It's called, I'm probably gonna butcher the title here, The Eternal Optimism of the Compassionate Conservative. And it's kind of, and I think it's useful, and the reason why I'm bringing it up here is the reason why it's kind of the eternal optimism. And he's talking about how the leadership of the Republican Party and oftentimes Republican members of Congress have a kind of a compassionate understanding of, and whether it's regards to social policy, really believe that a kind of the Republican suite of social policies is best to take and lift people out of poverty. It's best for racial minorities. However, it's been clear, according to Tellis and obviously many other political scientists, that the Republican base is not interested in these so-called compassionate reforms. And so there's always going to be the cycle of, there's going to be a movement for Republican leadership to push and say, hey, we have been too harsh in the past. Let's actually move to a kinder, more gentler Republican Party. And then you'll have the buy-in from members of Congress and or from Republican elites. But then in terms of, as a result of the re-election incentive, members of Congress then get pulled in sometimes extreme directions. And so I've been thinking a lot about, in terms of why it's also necessary to think much more about what is required for racial justice and how to engage kind of a different base of voters into that. So I'll end there. Thanks a lot. It's good to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So reading through some of the questions that have been posed, I see a theme, and maybe I'll pose this question to the panelists, which is, sort of where is this increase in affective polarization coming from? Is this about a sense of alienation from the economy and globalization? Is this racism? Is it a combination of factors? And then is there something that can be done to kind of dial this back and maybe Megan has sort of touched on this more than some of the other panelists, to a sort of deprogramming of sorts for society to, so that we don't just have this continuing ratcheting up. And I'll just throw that question. It's sort of several questions combined, but I think it embodies some of what's happening in the Q&A box.
Is there anyone in particular that you want to?
No, Shanto, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay, so I saw the question on the potential, on the causes and the potential treatments. It comes up. This typically comes up in most of these discussions, and there are these short-term shocks, as you indicated, Justin. So obviously, racial inequities in policing, stuff that's been happening in terms of globalized economy, immigration, all of those things can contribute. But I think if you look at the structural antecedents of affective polarization, they're more long-term, they're more deep-seated, and I would probably list the following. Number one is sorting. The fact that the party cleavage in the United States is increasingly now reinforcing a variety of other social cleavages, most notably the racial cleavage. So the Republican Party is the party of whites, the Democratic Party is the party of non-whites, we've got the gender cleavage, we've got the urban-rural cleavage, so on and so forth. So you've got a pattern of reinforcing cleavages, and the comparative politics literature makes it pretty clear that when you've got reinforcing as opposed to cross-cutting cleavages, there tends to be the potential for strife. That's number one. Number two, I would say, is opinion leadership, elite rhetoric. If you look at campaigns over the last 30 years, it's pretty clear that attacking the opposition is the dominant strategy. And so, as we know from the persuasion literature, that's going to contribute to a more hostile set of rank and file. Number three, this is surprisingly a point of contention in the literature. This is the notion of echo chambers in the new media environment. I would argue that there is evidence of selective exposure, that people are now tuning in to like-minded news sources, Fox on the right, Fox or Breitbart, Rachel Maddow, MSNBC, HuffPost, what have you, on the left. It's not huge, but there clearly is this kind of alignment of audiences in terms of partisanship. So let's say I'm trying to, so I guess I've listed three. I'll stop there just in terms of time. Treatment, well, we could always go to war and we could have national unity in the name of patriotism, but I'm not sure people would recommend that. It's contact, there's the old-fashioned contact hypothesis that we're now so segregated that we never ever get to have a beer with someone on the opposing side. Maybe that's something that might help. More interpersonal contact across the party divide. Although given, as I said earlier, given what we know about household homogeneity, that's also somewhat of a difficult ask.
Yeah. Diana, did you have?
Yeah, well, I'm actually a little more optimistic, only in the sense that I do think there's a tendency for us to think about affective polarization as a constant characteristic of people and not of the environment. And yet what we have seen in some of our data, even during the Trump administration, which is obviously a very polarized period of time, is that the time period when we're measuring affective polarization is typically right before an election, because that's when the American National Election Studies collects their data. That's a high point for polarization, for affective polarization. It actually does drop some in between that and October of 2020. And so part of what I'm hopeful about, and Shanto actually mentioned this, is elite rhetoric has been ratcheting it up. We obviously don't have the same degree of coverage of Biden as we had of Trump. Things have been ratcheted down in elite rhetoric since Biden took office. And the environment that we live in media-wise is not the same crisis a day kind of environment. So to some extent, I'm hopeful that turning down the intensity of politics in general may help to lower levels of affective polarization as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Megan, did you have anything that you wanted to add about like sort of the origins or of affective polarization?
No.
All right. Are any of our panelists think that the events of January 6th are sort of created an opportunity to try and dial down the rhetoric among political elites? I mean, it's sort of one thing I think that stands out to me in looking at some of the polling in the early Biden administration is, for example, with this newest stimulus bill or COVID relief bill, however you want to think about it, that it polled really well. And there seemed to be something akin to national unity around passing this. But at the elite level, that sort of unity didn't seem to manifest itself in any way, right? We didn't see any Republicans supporting this. And so I don't know, I'm curious to the extent to which there's sort of maybe a yearning among the public to have more unity among elected elites, but elected elites are in some way resistant to this from happening. Like, was there an opportunity created, as maybe it's weird to think of it in this way, by the events of January 6th?
I think
that's interesting.
Yeah, now I think a huge amount of it is going to depend on what happens within the Republican Party too. Simply because we do have those who tried to distance themselves from January 6th, and yet others have not in a lot of ways. So yeah, right now, obviously they're still all afraid of Trump from what we can see.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say it's interesting. I don't think I've thought about it as an opportunity, but I mean, there is, I think, ways in which you could think about January 6th as an opportunity. To me, I mean, I think that but I do often think about how it was useful in some ways. So I think that January 6th I think there's always been a sense that there's been some violence, but that it's not on our doorstep. And on January 6th, like it reached the doorstep of the nation's capital and it came into Congress, right? And then I think that in terms of, there's also been, I think for a lot of us, a lack of urgency from members of Congress and from the national political establishment to, as Diana mentioned, to ratchet it down a bit and to the very real consequences of this type of like increasing rhetoric and increasing polarization. And I think for a number of people who never thought that it would take Congress, that it would never get that far, that like, you know, because I think, you know, like the way in which we deal with poverty and racism, we know it's out there, but like, if we don't have to come face to face with it all the time, then we're kind of okay with not doing that much about it, right? And I think that was what was so interesting to me about January 6th is that came inside, it was no longer outside. And then people had to think much more about what they said and what they were going to do, because it was also clear that it was going to happen again, right? That this wasn't kind of this isolated incident, and the potential for it to happen sometime in the future was very strong. I think that's why so many of us like were holding our breath until inauguration, because we were worried about another violent attack on Congress or on, at that time, incoming President Biden.
Are there, you know, one of the things that strikes me is that, and I see this in the questions, and I think it's come up here a little bit, about the sense of politics being sort of a zero-sum game. And are there institutional changes that could be made to make politics seem less zero-sum? I mean, I guess as someone who studies subnational politics, I think about, are there opportunities to utilize American federalism in a way to make sort of national politics less, make it feel like not everything is at stake in national politics? Or are there, you know, thinking about Diana's work, are there electoral reforms? Are there reforms in primary systems where we can somehow get better strategic, I don't know, get more strategic voting, get something, you know, are there things that the ways we can design institutions as political scientists, or recommend institutional tweaks to help deal with this problem as well?
Well, I think the real underlying issue is this tension between majoritarianism and minority rights, right? So, I mean, the idea that you've got people in underpopulated areas with a considerable amount of clout, that seems to sort of, at some level, violate democratic norms. And so maybe, you know, increasing the size of the Senate, there's all this talk about Washington and Puerto Rico and so on and so forth. Maybe that's one way to move. Of course, people who study Congress, there's all this talk about the filibuster and what might be done there. So I'm not an institutionalist, so I don't want to sort of venture into this.
Maybe this isn't a fair question to ask, but Megan studies the development of American political institutions. Right?
I mean, here, listen, I was going to put on my public law hat too. I do the REP hat and the APD hat, and I can also do the public law hat. I think that there need to be limits on Supreme Court justices. I think that this idea that we have these justices who are here, who are here, but like Supreme Court justices and federal judges that are here in terms of tenure for a lifetime. I think that there's different systems, right, for judges in different countries that to me make more sense, whether it's kind of a rotating bench and one has 10 to 20 years of tenure to insulate them and to feel like in which judges feel protected, to that they're not like kind of shifted and pulled by kind of partisanship of specific parties, I think is really important. I think that so that's my public law. Now, I'm not going to get into the filibuster and the different ways to perhaps structure institutions in which that are not my main focus, but I am swayed by a number of my colleagues' arguments about how one might restructure different institutions, especially a number of my colleagues from comparative politics who are looking at different systems, right? I think that actually has really been helpful. And that it seems sometimes when we look at kind of American politics in our system, that there's only a few options available. And so that's why I think it's been useful, but that's it, I'll say on that.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think part of the problem, Justin, with this is that, you know, who's going to support those changes? Well, you have something to gain from it, right? So in a lot of ways, looking at changing demographics in this country and so forth, approaches that continue to create this kind of intergroup hostility, who do I see as having the most to lose from that? Well, right now it's the Republicans, because demographics really are not on their side if they continue down that road. So, you know, they're a small proportion relative to Democrats in this country. But, you know, if they interpret it that way and respond accordingly, they would be taking very different moves forward from what they're doing right now.
Yeah. I mean, to what extent is this sort of this really heightened level of affective polarization we're observing right now and what we saw on January 6th, the result of Trump? Or so do we expect that do we expect Trump to sort of fade away a little bit? And as Trump fades away a little bit, will all of this be ratcheted down to some extent? Will we see maybe a little bit of decline in affective polarization? Will we see, I mean, and I guess it's sort of balancing the Trump sort of somewhat of an exodus from American politics with this rise of kind of this sort of Trumpist taking control over state and local Republican Party organizations, which seems to be happening and is manifesting itself with these, you know, with the censure votes of Republicans who voted for Trump's impeachment and so forth. But do we expect sort of this movement of Trump down to Mar-a-Lago to sort of dial us back as a society somewhat?
I think it clearly didn't start with Trump. It precedes him. He certainly didn't help. But I think a lot of the answer to your question has to do with what the media choose to do. Do they continue to focus attention on Trump, or do they allow him to fade into the background? Because without some sustained attention to him, I think it will be hard to maintain. On the other hand, you know, he's the master of getting huge amounts of attention from the media, and that can certainly help him stay at the forefront of public attention.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think even the fact that his Twitter account is being shut off that's a plus. But on the other hand, the fact that he's a looming presence in the Republican Party, and the nomination is his for the taking, apparently, in 2024. And he's not going to come out and say, no, I'm not going to run, that's for sure. So that level, as long as he is there, I think you're going to get this deference and this fear of the Trump, of offending the Trump base. And so that's going to be, once he disappears from the political landscape, then perhaps there may be a ratcheting down and someone else takes over the Republican Party. But it's hard to say what direction that's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is also very much along the lines of my fellow panelists here that, like, I mean, in terms of this was around clearly before him, he is somebody that has morphed and transformed into different political figures at different moments in time. And I think one of his skills is kind of being perceptive of what people want and then being that. And it's clear that, for me at least, that, like, it's not necessarily like he is the symptom of something, kind of a larger sickness, right? I'm still thinking, when you asked that question, Justin, I was thinking I was on Twitter earlier today, and he sent out this Save America from Trump donate to donaldjtrump.com, no rhinos. And it's like this, like, give to Trump, not the RNC. We don't want any of that. Like, the future is ours. And so it's to me, it's quite clear that he is probably the most popular Republican politician right now. That there is many people that are following him, and even when if he fades away, let's pretend that something happens to him, that somebody will come and somebody will come into that space, that he activated and touched on much of what was previously hidden, and that something else will emerge. I think that we have to be really clear on, in terms of what, kind of the other part of the panel, which is national unity possible? To get to that, to really try to understand this larger division and what is providing this fuel to Trump and what is providing fuel to people like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz. Because they are these figures, because they also are tapping into something. And so we need to figure out what to do about these larger issues, part of which, clearly you guys understand this for me, part of which is racism, and that, like, part of what it means to move to national unity is to address deep racial inequality in our country. But it's not just racial inequality, right? It's economic issues, it's other issues as well, but those really need to be addressed before we can move into national unity. I think this is the last thing, is that people really were hoping that, like, when Trump went away, that everything would be like, I don't know, 2008. And it's not. So.
Yes, no, I remember when I think I was telling Diana when we started, before this panel began, that when Obama won in 2008, SIPA held the policy school here held a panel about what would, is like polarization going to decline during Obama years, because he seemed sort of like a post-partisan president, and in that panel, like the sort of theme of that panel couldn't have been more wrong, as we know. Polarization just continued to increase in dramatic ways. All right, well, I guess we're out of time here. So I just want to thank our panelists. Very interesting conversation, very interesting presentations. Thank you so much for taking time out of your really busy days to come and speak with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
And thank you to all of our attendees. It's great to have you here and to see your questions.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.